Welcome back, everyone, to the Mental Health Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Harrison, and with me today is Jason Nicholson, who has a practice in Washington, D.C., and he's been publishing and talking about election anxiety. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I am so excited to dive into this topic. I think it's very relevant. I think clinicians are dealing with it, but maybe people are not necessarily spelling it out as election anxiety. But first, I want to kind of go back a little bit and get to know a little about you. How did you get into this work of working in mental health and developing your own practice and all of those great things?
Sure. I graduated from NYU in their social work program and relocated to DC. So immediately sort of felt and identified there is working with folks in Washington, DC in particular, it's a complicated kind of connection to the government. A lot of people
Mm,
are working directly for the federal government or other agencies, and even nonprofits and other organizations adjunct and work with those governmental agencies themselves. So even the idea of former government shutdowns and kind of
mm,
it became really apparent that there is a political component in managing not only just general anxiety but also work related anxiety. And now as we're starting to see some of these cycles from 2016 till now is this cycle of political anxiety. So
mhm.
certainly felt really connected to kind of addressing and kind of acknowledging what I myself have been feeling personally as well. And I think a lot of listeners are also feeling some version of that kind of unknown and uncertainty, which in general is really uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. I think sometimes the hardest part of any difficult situation is the unknown, not knowing.
Absolutely. Right.
Hmm.
And certainly, I specialize in both managing political anxiety and sort of fears, but also financial anxiety. So really kind of those centers of avoidance and
Mm,
uncertainty and fear, there's a lot of commonality around all of these kind of very specific types of anxiety.
yeah. And then you moved to DC. So this all just fits in nicely for you there, I imagine,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, I will say my partner and I have relocated. Unfortunately, we're back in Connecticut, but I miss DC
Oh,
every second of every day. It is a
okay.
wonderful, wonderful place.
Gotcha. But you still work with clients in DC, correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
I do. I maintain my license and I'm just so connected to DC that I wanted to make sure that I held that kind of connection with them.
Right, that makes sense. So I think talking about this, I mean, you can't avoid in our political climate right now, like there's polarization, right? There's people on both sides that have big feelings, and even the debates coming person to person and the attacks going back and forth. I'm curious from just sort of that psychological perspective, how are you defining all of this, describing all of this? What is this coming from your perspective?
So really kind of the framework that I'm sort of operating from is this idea of there's very specific stressors and fears around kind of both political movements, overall
Mm,
trajectory of our government, different relationships with politics itself.
hmm.
So certainly, a very changing landscape of folks that are identifying as active voters or are paying attention to politics in general. I think it gets super complicated now because we have ingrained over the past 20 years the 24-hour news cycle and
Yeah,
sort of this very repetitive sort of perspective on what's going on. And then we have social media, which some mixed bag here, right?
for sure,
Certainly
for
some
sure.
amazing kind of pieces of being connected and communicating with others, but it certainly in some ways amplifies that division,
Mm,
sort of creates that bubble of kind of that kind of echo chamber in which we find ourselves. And certainly I think there's some real concern about kind of continued use of misinformation and kind of being able to fact check and kind of understand where we're getting our information from. I think those are all super complicated, and it coalesces in this idea of I don't know what's going to happen. And in some
Yeah.
ways, we don't know what's going to happen in November. But that decision becomes a, a focal point for some of us in it's going to create some consequences, no matter what that election sort
Mm,
of plays out to be. There are certainly people that have really strong feelings on either side of the political spectrum. And I think it's important because we're framing this as our politics, if we boil it down, is essentially a reflection of our values, what we find
mm,
important, how we build our lives, how we connect to each other, how we support one another. Essentially, that's the framework of politics here, of how we what we stand for, how we operate in our world. And there's a very strong divisiveness that creates that conflict
mhm.
between these ideas. Here's kind of my scope of values and here's how I'm operating, and your the other side of this kind of spectrum is the opposite, and
Mm,
seemingly there isn't a lot of crossover and a lot of middle ground, even though I think in reality there's plenty of it.
mm.
How we consume media, how we manage some of these things sort of tells us a story, a narrative that everyone is kind of framed in a certain way, which doesn't help create communication, doesn't help create that sense of mindfulness and kind of awareness of maybe our feelings in this.
Yeah. I love that piece that you shared about politics being a reflection of our values, because for me, that takes it down a notch. Like, of course, we can accept that other people have different values than we do. We encounter that every day. That feels a little more workable, maybe, than
Right.
some of the fighting and back and forth that occurs.
Yeah. And I think that really does speak to the kind of consumption of media and the narratives that are often created by what we hear, how we interpret that into our own lives, and sort of what it means to us and our families. I think that's the core
Hmm.
kind of
Hmm.
piece here is there are consequences for some families in no matter what the outcome of this election is. And I think
Absolutely.
as we as clinicians and coaches and providers need to at least acknowledge that that piece is there for a lot of folks.
Hmm.
And that's a scary, uncomfortable sort of feeling to be able to tolerate.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to also go back to this idea of fact checking that you mentioned. Do you have recommendations for that? Like when I think about fact checking right now, it seems challenging, right? Anyone can post on Twitter or X, or now that it's called, or Instagram, Facebook if they're older, maybe.
Yeah.
There's all these places, and then there's also news, but even the news seems to be like this channel seems more geared this way versus. So do you have any recommendations for fact checking?
So that's a really challenging sort of problem to navigate because I
Yeah.
think in the, if we're talking about macro view, I would always encourage kind of, hey, if you're exploring a specific event or some information that you are not sure of, sort of doing a quicker, deeper dive in terms of what other information populates in Google and sort of getting a flavor for maybe what the base facts of what we're talking about are. But in the real world, we're not going to do that. We're busy clinicians. Like
Yeah.
that's not always a thing that we can stop and pause and be able to do. There are a few organizations, I don't have any specific sort of relationships with any of them directly, but that are able to kind of coalesce news information and put it into a spectrum from
Mm.
more kind of liberal perspectives to more conservative perspectives. So there are ones that sort of combine all of those information. So as you're going through and reading the
Mm.
news on a daily basis, it highlights for you where in that space that's coming from. So if there's,
Ah.
certainly, again, I think one of the things that is really hard to do is to get a flavor for what the perspective is versus the idea of, a Fox News perspective might be very different than a CNN perspective. That's really hard to kind of figure out what the actual piece is that is going to be related to both what's happening in the world or our country and within our lives specifically.
Hmm.
So just being aware of even sort of the idea as I'm reading, having that critical kind of questioning perspective of kind of who's
Hmm.
writing this, where is it coming from, what are the goals of this communication, and sort of just being aware starts to shift, at least making some space for some potentially different perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. So let's talk a little bit about people who might be having election anxiety. Maybe we're all having election anxiety. How do you sort of explain to people who might be calling you to talk about this whether this is something that they need to come into therapy for or not?
So I really use this frame of reference as manageability, workability, right? So
Mm.
if we're talking about sort of um, anxiety um, responses, avoidance,
Mhm.
um, uh, real physical stress in terms of muscle tension, headaches, jaw clenching, some of these more physical behaviors. Certainly, I think there's having a dedicated space to address thoughts, feelings,
Mm.
and then creating an action plan of sort of where the action is for me to take towards my goals and values, I think is always really important to be able to provide that space for folks.
Mhm.
Um, Certainly, again, acknowledging what the reality is. The reality is that we are in a very tight
Yeah.
race here, no matter what perspective that you're coming from, is this is going to be a challenging few months. I'd like to say that will be a little bit more space after the election, but we still don't know that either. And that again sort of creates this fear of what if.
Mhm.
And I think acknowledging kind of when a client is sort of operating from that what if perspective, I think is really important to name it, acknowledge it, hopefully not judge it, but then
Mhm.
figure out how do I want to respond to this feeling in a way that feels right to me as the individual. I think that's
Mhm.
a key component.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, even thinking of these next few months, we don't know what's going to happen or what will transpire, any of it, but we can control our responses. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. It was some work, maybe.
It's really difficult to do sometimes. And
Hmm.
again, I think there's not enough folks talking about it from a political sort of perspective in kind of, there are still some really strong feelings about the 2016 election here,
Yeah.
right? About kind of the 2020 election, even, combining it with this visceral experience that we all had during pandemic.
Yeah.
I think we're still sort of starting to acknowledge that there's some national trauma that we have gone through.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. We can't address trauma if we're not naming it or not acknowledging it's there.
Hmm. Yeah, and thinking through that for me, I always think about how if we are in a trauma state of some kind, we're operating from our limbic brain, our much more emotional brain, right? And I do think that we see a lot more emotional responses right now politically. And that was one of my questions too for you. And you may not have an answer to this, but I was just reflecting on this myself. It feels to me, living in this time, that these elections have been so much more intense. But have they? Is it always this way? Have we changed? Have the elections changed? I don't know. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
So I'm sure a journalist or political science perspective might be very different than mine, but the reality I think is that when the present moment isn't very different than in some ways of our past moments.
Hmm.
There are some key differences in terms of how we operate in terms of communication, our ability
Yeah.
to
Hmm.
reach larger audiences, the again that consistent, 24-hour. I have clients that have it on the background all day, every day. So you're marinating in both this kind of news cycle, but also the emotional response to that news cycle, right?
Right.
That's why we have pundits who are very clearly kind of communicating their feelings and opinions in a way that feels like news and fact, but is not. And I think that's hard for us to decipher the two. So I think
Hmm.
there's certainly some key differences in terms of how we interact and connect and talk about politics now than we used to. But I
Yeah.
think that again, that differing value perspective has always been a component of us choosing party leaders and
Hmm.
representatives and being a
Hmm.
part of that, our democracy.
Yeah.
Um, I think it feels more visceral now because we are all sort of responding to this news, to this
Hmm.
amount of information in a new way.
Yeah. That makes sense. You kind of referenced this earlier about social media has its pluses and minuses, but as far as treatment goes, if you're working with an individual, do you ever recommend decreasing either time on screen or time watching the news? Is that ever a part of what you do?
It certainly is. I think it's really important to kind of, in a way, integrate kind of checking in on social media consumption in the same way that we check in with substance usage,
Mm.
alcohol usage, tobacco and caffeine usage. I think this is a key component to be able to kind of make sure is sort of embedded in the therapy experience across the board.
Mm.
The goals of changing your relationship to media and media consumption, I think, really needs to be based on the individual. So
Yeah.
certainly I work with a ton of folks in DC. Being on top of and aware of kind of what's going on is sort of an important component for their career perspective. So we
Mm.
don't talk about we talk about intentionality in this, right? So again, sort of the mindless sort of doom scrolling sort of thing on Twitter or X, whatever it is, Instagram, TikTok now. There's a passivity in that that I think is really important to kind of pay attention to. So
Mm.
if part of this is creating spaces for being mindful and intentional. So I sort of reverse engineer. So
Hmm.
I talk to folks about how do you want to feel after you read the news the next day, right? If we're talking about consistent sort of pervasive anxiety that is the pit in your stomach, the avoidance, the I'm going to call out of work, I'm going to not talk to my family because we have maybe
Mm.
different values or different political perspectives. That sounds no longer workable. So we need
Yeah.
to come up with a different sort of game plan. I think again, mindful intentionality, I think, is the key component of all of this.
Hmm.
And
Well,
again, it's hard because I want to be less on have spend less time on my phone as well, but I find myself sort of scrolling CNN or MSNBC, and it takes a lot of work to be in a space to pay attention to that in the moment.
hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it really does. And I know there are so many studies out there that correlate, like even just watching the news, how much you watch the news with your level of anxiety is correlated,
Yeah.
right? So we have data that shows us that this makes us anxious, and yet it's hard for us not to when there's just this world of information at our fingertips.
Yeah. And I think that goes to the core of, I think what I would encourage clinicians and clients to sort of focus on is where the sense of control might be, right?
Mm,
I, as an individual, have no control over the outcome of this election. I never did. I, as an individual and citizen of the country, am going to show up and vote and cast my perspective and
yeah,
and take that initiative. Um, but also realizing there are some other things that I can do if it feels appropriate to someone, right? There are ways to volunteer, either
mm,
with a political perspective or an issue perspective, if there's something that
yeah,
really resonates in your life or with your family. I think there are a ton of ways to sort of get involved, even focusing more on local than sort of these larger national perspectives and sort of
yeah.
identifying where we can have impact in our local communities. Um, and again, I want to be really kind here. There are going to be some folks that just don't have the gas in the gas tank to be able to tolerate this. So
Mm,
meaning it is okay if you need to take a step back from all news for a bit,
mhm,
or and kind of, I'm gonna maybe I'm gonna decide I'm gonna vote, but everything else I'm gonna focus on other parts of my life. That sounds really kind in a way. And again, sort of
mm,
balancing that workability and feasibility with what really resonates with you as an individual and your values.
mm. I like that. Yeah, there's a lot in there to think about for sure. So, anything else that you would recommend to people in order to stay healthy or at our best during this time?
So certainly I think self-care means so many things to so many
Mm,
people, but again, sort of this idea of making sure that you are doing what you need I talk with my clients about being a cell phone. Like I would never in a million years let my cell phone get down to 5% battery, but I'd let myself get down to 1%. Right. So
mm,
this idea of sort of not just, it can be any version of this taking care of yourself, but really being intentional about what recharges your battery. If you don't have bandwidth to be able to tolerate some of the things that are going on, that sounds like an indicator of we need to prioritize sort of making sure that you have energy to be able to respond to things in a way as things change that respond in a way that feels really right to you.
mm,
You need energy for that, and I think that's a key component. And the other piece is just really kind of hopefully normalizing reaching out to a therapist or to a provider for the space to talk about this, right?
mhm.
Particularly in a non-judgmental space.
Yeah.
I think some people are afraid to voice specific fears or concerns.
Mm,
And also there's a dilution, like we're all sort of on edge in a way. So there's a lot of answering for other people of no one has the space or availability to really listen to me.
yeah,
But it,
it's true.
but that also halts kind of that space that you need to be able to figure out what my feelings are, what my thoughts about these things, what do I want to do about it.
Hmm. Amazing. Well, Jason, I have learned a lot from chatting with you today. So thank you so much for sharing all this with us. We are out of time, but if you want to find out more about Jason and his practice, all the links will be in the show notes, as well as his article on election anxiety. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much. This has been great.